Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Starks and I'm the Life Science Practice Leader for Centri. Joining me today is Jeff Cehlar, a director in our risk advisory practice. The purpose of our discussion is to share some common pitfalls and best practices related to establishing internal controls for R&D clinical testing costs. For biotechs and other companies developing drug candidates to be approved by the FDA, conducting clinical trials is a necessary function of the business of drug development. The majority of monies raised by biotechs is used in such development. The COVID-19 crisis contributed to an adoption of decentralized clinical trial components. For example, as of June 2022, 32% of registered clinical studies are located in the United States. Between 2020 and 2021, mobile applications and devices were being integrated into clinical trial designs, as evidenced by the 130% increase in the mention of text messages in clinical trial protocols. And finally, drug clinical trials that utilize decentralized or virtual components increased by 93% in 2021. In summary, clinical trials can represent the majority of cash spending of companies developing a drug, and the related effort for executing the clinical trials are conducted by third-party organizations. In 2020, 42% of traditional IPOs disclosed material weaknesses in their S-1 filings. The majority of material weaknesses disclosed related to the financial reporting close process, where the effort and analysis of determining the accrued or prepaid balances for clinical trial activities typically reside. Accordingly, having strong internal controls during all phases of a clinical trial lifecycle are critical to supporting the accuracy, existence, and completeness of the related financial statement areas. With that, why don't we talk a little bit about the life cycle of clinical trial activities?
Thanks, Ryan. So from this perspective, we're going to break a clinical trial up into 4 components. They are the planning and startup activities, conducting the trial itself, analyzing the results, and lastly, sharing those results. So as it relates to planning and startup phase, we're going to discuss the activities, some of the risks within those activities, and as well as some of the internal controls that companies should have to mitigate those risks. So as it relates to this planning and startup phase, some of the planning and startup activities include determining if the study will be conducted in-house or by a third-party contract research organization. It could be designing the trial and preparing the sites, preparing various trial documents that have to be completed before that starts, and creating an overall data management plan. So what are some of the risks that could happen as it relates to these different activities? And there are 2 main risks here as it relates to the financials, and that's the lack of visibility by finance personnel into the projects and the related contracts themselves, which could lead to errors down the road in accounting for them. And also a lack of detailed budgets for these trials, which could then result in poorly tracked or uncontrolled spends on these various projects and trials. And so what types of controls can management and companies put in place over these risks? Well, one of the first things they should do is they should create spreadsheets for each of these projects that would note all the different terms within the contracts, including payments, various milestones and things along those lines, and have one for each project or each study that's going on. And then also you want to make sure you have a detailed budget for that trial. Some costs may be external with a CRO, some costs may be internal. So having that detailed budget will really allow you to track your spend against that to ensure that you're controlling those costs. One thing to consider as well is that there are actually certain clinical trial softwares that are available that could be used instead of spreadsheets that companies may want to consider implementing. Next phase here is conducting a trial. And so this is, really the bulk of the work here, right? So they're going to actually assign responsibilities, whether it's internal people again or CROs. You have to recruit patients. You have to physically conduct the trial, ensuring patient safety, and gathering and compiling all of that data. So that's a lot of work that happens in these trials. And so some of the risks are lack of insight, again, by finance into the progress of these trials. Finance is on the outside. They're not there day to day, as part of these various trials that are going on. And so if finance isn't aware of what's going on and the status of these, it can lead to inaccurate accounting results. And what does that mean? Well, there may be things like prepaids that happen at the very beginning of a contract. And so if the company has to pay up front, that may go out, but you may have to put that into a prepaid account and amortize it over the life of a study. Or there may be trials going on where the company hasn't been invoiced, and therefore we need to accrue for those costs that have been incurred, but you have not yet received an invoice. And so it's very important that finance is well aware of the status of these trials, what's going on, both at the CRO level and even at the site level, depending on the detail of the contract and how the spend may occur. And so if the data is not coming in timely to finance, there can be a disconnect in whether or not they need to accrue for something, amortize a prepaid, or just directly expense something. So what kind of controls can the company and can management put in place? Well, meetings with the clinical department or the CRO to discuss what's going on, and having regular meetings, right, at least monthly, to determine the status of these clinical trials so they can determine how to properly account for them based on the status of the project and the contract as it was written. And then also just reviewing the results of that tracking spreadsheet once you've put all the data into it to determine if you need to record an accrual, you have to have a prepaid, or whether it's just being expensed directly. And so those are very critical. That's probably the biggest area where these errors are occurring from a financial statement perspective, whether it's just timing or incorrect numbers, because finance doesn't have the data to make the appropriate determination of what should be recorded and where. And same thing again here, there are softwares that can be used to track all this that doesn't have to be done in Excel, but it'll depend on what management wants to do and whether they want to spend it. But at a minimum, it can be done within Excel. Next phase here is analyzing the results. And so, this one's pretty self-explanatory, but once the trial is done, all the data has been compiled, it's going to be analyzed, not just for the actual results of the trial and the drugs themselves, but then there should be an analysis from a financial perspective. You want to determine how the spend went. Did it go according to the timeline? All those sort of things should be analyzed from a financial perspective as well, because again here, if you're not tracking that and analyzing it, you may have spent way over what you anticipated, or even way over what was approved and authorized to be spent. And so if you're not analyzing that data when everything's done, you're missing out on figuring out whether or not you could have done something more efficiently, or something wasn't approved and should have been in advance of the spend occurring. And so again, the controls around that are pretty straightforward, right? It's having that detailed budget that we spoke about at the beginning, and then actually analyzing the actual spend against that budget, hopefully at a detailed level. That would be the best way, so you could see where it went wrong, but at least at an overall spend basis, so you can determine, did we spend more than we expected? And again, what could be done in the future? And similar story here. All of this can be done in softwares if they're something that you want to look into, but Excel still works very well here to analyze the data. Last phase here we're going to talk about is sharing the results then. And so what does that mean? Well, again, sharing the results can be done in many different ways. They can be done in peer journals, they can be published online. But from our perspective, again, from a financial risk perspective, really what we're worried about is disclosing the results. And so what risk can happen here as it relates to disclosing the results to the public? Well, if you're disclosing inaccurate data or incomplete data, you have the risk that you could be misleading investors. And you don't want that happening. Clinical trials are really tend to be what investors are focused on, and scrutinize a lot. So you don't want to have inaccurate or incomplete disclosures. So what controls can management put in place to mitigate this risk of inappropriate disclosure? Well, again, finance and people writing these disclosures really need to meet with the people that are closest to these trials, whether it's the clinical department, the contract research organization, whomever they are, meet, understand, and write the disclosure with their guidance. And then secondly, have somebody independent review it once it's done to determine if everything makes sense to them and is again appropriate and in line with the results of the trial. All right, so at that point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ryan here, to sort of wrap it up. I hope this was informative and was able to give you guys some background on clinical trials and controls.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for that insightful perspective and really detailed guidance on establishing internal controls related to R&D clinical testing costs. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.